give him a welcome. And
Thank you so much. Is it okay if I'm right here, or should I go? Are you okay? All right. You can hear me okay? Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I got into the Denver area 2 days ago, so this is actually my second phase of a book tour. The book actually came out, Border Patrol Nation, which I usually have in my hand, but I forgot to bring up. Came out in March, and so I did a little bit of a tour, or a big tour in the spring, and now I'm starting up my fall tour. So I'm here in Colorado, and then I'm going to do an East Coast leg of the tour a little bit later on in the fall. So it's really an honor to be here with you tonight. I battled traffic all the way from the north side of Denver to get here. Yeah. But anyhow, let me get started. Maybe a good place to start would be the summer, some of the things that happened this summer. And I don't know if folks saw everyone here is familiar with Sean Hannity, right? The reporter from Fox News, on July 10th he was doing an investigative report on the U.S.-Mexico border in the state of Texas, and he was with Governor Rick Perry of Texas, and I don't know if anyone saw this report, but they were on the Rio Bravo, or the Rio Grande, and Rick Perry actually had a black flak jacket on, and between Hannity and Perry there was a machine gun. The machine gun was aimed across the river, so towards Mexico. The point of the investigation was that they were trying to prove, this was right before Rick Perry ordered 1,000 National Guard to the Texas border. It was right before that. It was like 5 days before that. But the point was to show this border is porous, right? This border, there's nothing on the border. It's been neglected by the federal government, and that was a whole point of Perry's report. And of course this was happening right in the heat of the moment with the children. There was it was all over the media that there were thousands of children arriving to the southern border from Central America, from Honduras, from El Salvador, from Guatemala. Now I think the number is, and this year it's 66,000 kids. So how many people here have been to the U.S.-Mexico border? Quite a few. Okay. Now, in your opinion, I'll pose the question to you: is the border porous? No. Not hardly. In spots. Okay. Okay, let's back up one bit. How many? Okay. Does anybody know when the Border Patrol was founded? Guesses. When was it? When was it, Maureen? 1924, right? So between 1776 and 1924, there was no Border Patrol, right? It was founded in 1924. There was less than 1,000 agents. So what was the growth of the U.S. Border Patrol from, say, 1924 to 1994? How many Border Patrol agents were there in 1994? 1,000? Thousands. Okay, 4,000. So you have to look. It went from about 500 to 4,000 over a span of how many years? 70 years. That's a fairly slow rate of growth. It was an agency that was more or less of an afterthought in the eyes of the U.S. government. What changed? 1994 to now. How many U.S. Border Patrol agents are there now? Any guesses? 10,000. More. Less. 23,000. 23,000 U.S. Border Patrol agents. So the growth from 1994 to 2014, 20 years, was astronomical. unprecedented, historic. Never have we had so many U.S. Border Patrol agents, 5 times the size as it was in 1994. Now, one of the significant changes was 9/11, right? There were operations before 9/11 that increased the personnel in the Border Patrol, but after 9/11, you saw an agency go from about 8,000 to 23,000 in just a matter of a few years. And you saw the Border Patrol go from the Department of Justice to the Department of Homeland Security. And that was the creation of Customs and Border Protection, which is the parent agency of the U.S. Border Patrol. And Customs and Border Protection has 65,000 agents, right? The reason I bring up Customs and Border Protection is because it not only includes the Border Patrol, and not only includes the people in the ports of entry, like the customs agent, they have a Office of Air and Marine. So they have an Air Force and they have a Navy. They have a special forces units. So we're looking at what some people are beginning to call a domestic army on U.S. soil. You add to that ICE. ICE did not exist pre-9/11. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That's 20,000. So you go 65,000 plus 20,000, you're 80,000 agents, all under the Department of Homeland Security, which is about 200,000. So that's a huge mission within the Department of Homeland Security, right? You add to that 650,000 police. 650,000 police who are working with ICE in different programs, who are working with the Border Patrol and CBP in different programs. So you're talking a huge shifts and it's this kind of massive growth that I document in Border Patrol Nation. But there's one kicker, and this is that we're going to go back to the Sean Hannity report on the border, on the actual borderline. Could you? One kicker is that's the borderline, right? You see that? The borderline is no longer just a line. It's not just, it is a line. You can call it the boundary line. The actual border enforcement zones, and this is what this map is. This map was done by the ACLU, and they call it a constitution-free zone. That is from the international boundary, 100 miles inland, along the 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border, up the coast, along the 4,000-mile U.S.-Canada border, and down the east coast. That is all Border Patrol jurisdiction. So for example, let me back up again about the growth. Budget. If you look at the budget for the Border Patrol, obviously with the personnel, the budget rises as well. You look at the budget, again, 1994, somewhat of a afterthought. 2014, now the budgets for border and immigration enforcement, and that includes Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and it comes to $18 billion. Now, why is that number significant? Anybody know? That number is really significant because that is more than all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. Big federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI, the DEA, the U.S. Marshals, all of those combined come to $14.4 billion. So it's about $4 billion more than all of the rest of the federal law enforcement agencies combined. It is a high priority for the U.S. federal government. This has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. So to sit on the border and say, oh, there's nothing here, it's neglected, it's far from the truth. If you look at the budgets, over the span of the last 20 years, rising, personnel rising. And all of this gets put into these jurisdictions. And the jurisdictions are important because they, for example, surveillance towers, they're not put on there's a camera post put on the actual borderline, but surveillance towers are put 10 miles, 15, 20 miles back. Checkpoints. Has anybody here gone through a Border Patrol checkpoint? They're all over this in the Southwest. They're all over the place, right? You can't travel without stopping at a checkpoint where an agent of the Department of Homeland Security looks at you, does a visual inspection of your car, asks you your citizenship. If something alarms them, if they think, okay, there's 3 priority missions for the U.S. Border Patrol. One of them is immigration enforcement. So if they think that you're undocumented, or if they think you have an undocumented person in the car, then they can pull you in a secondary inspection and ask you a number of questions. Another mission is drug interdiction. If they think you're smuggling drugs, or their dogs, because they have lots of dogs that sniff out your cars. If their dogs alarm them, and there's a lot of false alarms actually. They're going to do ACLU in Arizona is going to do a report on that soon. They could pull you in a secondary inspection. They could search your car. But does anybody know what the number 1 mission in the post 9/11 era of the U.S. Border Patrol is? Terrorism. That's the big change. So the number 1 priority mission, go to cbp.gov, look it up, it's right there, is to stop terrorists and weapons of mass destruction from entering the United States. So you have those 3 missions, and those missions, so if you get pulled over in those jurisdictions right here, if they're not going to ask you for your driver's license, or they're not going to pull you over for speeding. Probably I've been pulled over by Border Patrol, they'll ask you your citizenship first. But if they suspect any of those things about you, they could detain you. And so that's an important way to conceptualize what the border is now. Of course, if you look along the California coast, of course, the Border Patrol is not all the way up there, in certain places. Along the East Coast, I don't think they're in North Carolina, the actual U.S. Border Patrol. But the fact is, the blueprint's laid out, and they are in surprising places, more and more surprising places, and I'll get to that in a minute. But that's essentially the core of what I'm talking about in Border Patrol Nation. What I do in Border Patrol Nation is I look at this massive expansion, but I try to get the stories. I go and talk to all kinds of different people. I've interviewed probably dozens of Border Patrol agents, Border Patrol agents ranging in all kinds of spectrums and viewpoints of what it is to be a Border Patrol agent, including dissenting agents. Including dissenting agents that are working and not really expressing their dissent, to gung-ho agents as well. I interview politicians, I interview undocumented people, I interview activists, I try to get the stories, the core stories of what this means, of this expansion. That's the core narrative of the book. And one of the things I look at is how these areas are filled. And if you could, one of the things I try to look into is the idea of is there a variation of an industrial complex? And does anybody know what this is, the Border Security Expo? Has anybody here heard of it? You have? Border Security Expo, over there you can see it better. Intelligence, collaboration, technology, innovation. This is a yearly expo. One of the things I did during my research of Border Patrol Nation was go to a number of trade shows around the country. The primary trade show around border security is this one. It happens every year in Phoenix, usually in March. Y'all should go this year. But what it says down there, intelligence, collaboration, technology, innovation, kind of speaks for what it's about. So anybody have a guess what this is? It's basically a conference. A lot of high-level Department of Homeland Security officials come. High-level ICE, high-level CBP. They talk about what the future is. The future, how we're going to bolster our borders, what we need on the border, what are some of the technologies? What are the strategies going to be? This is the kind of things that people talk about. But there's also another really important sector that shows up. Any guesses? Private sector. Vendors, private companies. Private companies show up and they have a big exhibition hall. And so you go in to the expo, and if you you might look up, and it's a high ceiling in a room, and you'll see like banners of different companies that probably people recognize. You'll see Raytheon, for example, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, to name a few. Also, you'll see an aerostat. That's called an aerostat, and it's a surveillance balloon. And one of the vendors, I talked to a vendor of one of these surveillance balloons once, and he pointed to the ceiling, and he said, "There's my surveillance balloon way across the room." And he said, I can hone in on your notebook and read your words on your paper And I said, no, there's no way you can do that. It's like, yes, I can. And we went back and forth like that. No, yes, no, yes. And then he started manipulating the camera with a kind of Xbox controller. Next thing I know, there's my page on a monitor like that. All my words for everyone to read in the expo. That's one. In 2013, the masterpiece of the expo was this tower. It was right in the middle of the conference hall, and I said, "Well, I'm going to go to this tower. I'm going to climb up all the stairs because from the top of the stairs you can see the whole expo. You can see the 200 vendors, selling their wares. You could see all their wares. You could see the surveillance towers. You can see the cameras. You can see the guns. You could see the drones." They sell drones, or mini drones, including mini drones. And so I walked up the stairs, and to my left-hand side as I walked up the stairs, there's a gigantic photo of that very anti-ballistic tower withstanding a gigantic fireball. And I went, whoa. Like, fireballs are hitting the U.S.-Mexico border? Really? Does anybody here heard of fireballs hitting the U.S.-Mexico border? Anybody? Not yet. Maybe it'll happen. To my knowledge, there hasn't been any there hasn't been a fireball that's hit the U.S.-Mexico border yet, but who knows? But that's the kind of thing. The reason I bring this up too, that's the kind of thing that happens at these high-powered expos, is this dance between Homeland Security, border security, and private interests. And private interests definitely want to sell their product. So they definitely want to create a need. And so you go back and forth, and then that kind of imagination of what this border is. Then you go back to Rick Perry in the flak jacket, or somebody with a machine gun, right? And that, so that's the kind of thing you see in these. Could you, yeah. So this is just another example. It's a tactical vest and night vision goggles. This is a FLIR, which actually has a contract with Customs and Border Protection. They sell thermal cameras that sense body heat, and high-powered, sophisticated camera equipment. They already have a big multi-million-dollar contract with CBP. That's another example, fixed-wing aircraft. These are the kinds of things that people are trying to sell. This is one of my favorites. I know the vendor every year. I say that I go in, and there he is, sitting there right at the beginning, and he said, "Hey, do you want another sample bag?" And I'm like, "Sure." And it's as advertised. The bag contains a urine bag, and you can go to the bathroom in it, and it will crystallize. But the thing I haven't asked him because I feel bad asking him, but I want to tell him, most Border Patrol agents are way out in the desert. Why would they could go, But that's it goes to show there's a lot of different products being sold. They're not necessarily just technologies or guns, or there's ready to eat meals that have a 3-year storage life. There's Ray-Ban sunglasses that are military grade that are sold. There's all kinds of different products that are sold.
Is the woman's version of that the same as the men?
That's the thing. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is definitely made for men. There is not a women's version for that, which is a very good point.
But there is for camping.
There is for, yeah. Or at least not in the sample bag, That's not in the sample bag.
What proportion
There's it's a very small percentage. It's below, I think it's below 10. I don't know the exact number, but I believe it's under 10%. But there are women Border Patrol agents, and I do see them all the time in the field. Just there's way more men. This is another company. I find their slogan really interesting. You draw the line, and we'll help you secure it, right? So this company was actually selling surveillance towers and a surveillance system with an operational control room. So they were vying for one of the contracts that was actually awarded in the spring, and they didn't get the contract. But they actually have helped bolster borders in Jordan, in Egypt, and other places overseas. So they're trying to bring their technology of a surveillance system, with a kind of war room where agents sit and watch, these cameras as they detect people 2, 3, 4, 5 miles down the way. But I find their slogan interesting. You draw the line, we'll help you secure it, because that raises a lot of provocative questions. Who draws the line, right? I can draw the line. You can draw the line. Can you draw the line? Can you draw the line? If you had the money and you draw the line right through this right here, through this room, and they come and secure it. If you had the line, if you had the money to do that, thus separating one side from the other, would they do that? I mean, it raises all kinds of provocative questions.
Yeah, isn't the line already drawn?
Right, but there are lines that are drawn, but can they not be moved, or other lines drawn in other places? Or what if a line needs to be drawn here or there? Or how far does this line drawing go? I mean, those are the kind of questions it lends itself to. Could you? And then this is I talked to this vendor for quite a while. The technology that he was selling was called Freedom on the Move. Freedom on the Move. He was a very interesting person to talk to because he talked about the actual border situation in very vivid language, and he actually used football terms to describe the actual. For example, the border line was a line of scrimmage. So then the border crossers were crossing the borderline undetected, right? And so, let me back up here. Why would he say that? Why would he be saying that the border crossers were crossing the line undetected?
Was it part of the drill?
Because he wants to sell things to detect them.
He wants to sell, but if you think about it, what he is saying is that most border crossers are not crossing through urban areas. This is where we go back to the idea of a porous border, right? They're not crossing through the urban areas, which have the 18-foot high walls, that have the camera posts, that have the agents sitting their X's side by side by side by side. They have a concentration. It's almost impossible to cross in the urban areas. So, and this comes from the operations actually from the mid-1990s. It's a strategy called prevention by deterrence. So the idea is close off these areas where people traditionally crossed, like Nogales used to have a chain link fence. In the early, up to 1990, there was a chain link fence, and people would cross through the hole in the fence, and so on and so forth. Close off these areas, and then people would be forced to go around them into areas that were so remote, so dangerous, so desolate, that it would be a natural barrier to them crossing. That was the idea. What happened was not quite that. So these first operations like that happened in the mid-1990s. At the same time, the immigration from Mexico went upsurged. It was the post-NAFTA era, the immediate post-NAFTA era in Mexico. You see this, what was almost unprecedented immigration coming from Mexico from about 1995 to 2005, about 400,000, 500,000 people per year. And they'd hit these enforcement zones and go around them and end up crossing the border undetected, right? Through the Arizona desert, which was supposed to be a natural barrier. People are still crossing the border undetected, right? I just interviewed a woman who was walking through the desert for 8 days, On the fourth day, and she was walking through the mountains. On the fourth day, they ran out of water, or they ran out of food. So that when you run out of water, you start drinking really dirty water from cow troughs. They ran out of food. She started describing walking and hallucinating. She started talking about the mountains speaking to her as they walked. Then she remembers, like she started vaguely remembering some incidents. Like we arrived to the road, and then somebody called because a lot of us were desperate, and they called the Border Patrol so they'd come. And then she described a scenario where 4 or 5 people in the group their noses started spontaneously bursting with blood, and then she I guess she passed out, and when she woke up, she had an electronic shock machine on her chest. She was in a hospital, and she thinks that she died, but she didn't, and came back to life. That she was resuscitated. Who knows? But her story is a rather common one. It's a common one for since the 1990s. 6,000 remains of border crossers have been found. It's impossible to walk through the desert without having some sort of health issue after, usually dehydration. It's super, super hot in the summer. And so when could you turn it one more? So when he was saying that the people cross the border undetected, he was saying then this technology, which is basically a video camera surveillance system mounted on the back of a truck, would get them in the quote-unquote last mile. So he said that it would be like a roving, in the football terminology, it would be like a roving linebacker, right? So after the people walk 2, 3, 4 days, 5 days, sometimes even longer, when they're weak, this is when freedom on the move comes in. And I want to stress that he, as a vendor, he's talking to me, and I'm a journalist, and I definitely have a tag that says I'm a journalist. But he's selling me his product, right? He's a vendor. He thinks that he's talking to me, trying to sell me the product. He knows I'm not going to buy it, but he probably hopes as a journalist I will write favorably about his product. And it's this kind of, why wouldn't he think that way? If you look at the border security market, and there is a border security market now, and you look at the different market projections, every single one of them show the border security market growing at least a 5% clip. The most recent projection I saw had it growing at, and they said it was an unprecedented boom period for border security. It is a good thing to invest in. He is talking to this market that he knows is expanding. It's a global market. One example is video surveillance. The market for video surveillance in 2012, $12 billion. The market projection for 2020, $40 billion. So it's more than triple the projection. In 2020, they say that they're going to get 3.4 trillion video hours of footage. And I did the calculations, it's 340 million 340 million years of video footage in 1 year. That's what's being anticipated. That's the future that's being actually projected at kind of these expos. Pardon me? Well, it depends. I mean, this is actually what I'm not talking about is just in the United States. This is actually a global projection. So we're looking at borders all over the world, and probably a lot of it nobody will be reviewing. It's just cameras, just out there.
So does that come down to a camera for every man, woman, and child in the U.S.? Because if we're supposed to be a population of 330 million.
Yeah, except that's global, right?
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it's a lot of cameras and a lot of footage, but that's just one example. If you look at any of the kind of gadgets, the technologies that we're seeing with border security, all of it's increasing, and that's just one example of it. So So when you go to the Border Security Expo, it is almost like going into a sort of science fiction pavilion in a way. And some of the stuff you see, it's, are you serious? Nobody's going to put this on the border. Like the mini drones I was talking about. Like there's Frisbee-like drones, and you throw it, and you can then, guide it, and then it has cameras equipped to it. There's other mini drones, as they call them, that they're studying locust wings. Locust wings for these real mini drones that can get into crevices and get into areas that, that maybe they normally, a predator-to-bee drone couldn't get into. But you think like it's science fiction, there's a lot of this that probably won't show up on the border, but then again, you look at it, like those are the fleet of predator-bee drones that the U.S. Border Patrol has now. And if you go back 20 years ago, would we have thought it? Would it have been possible to think that planes that were controlled by people on the ground of that size, with high-tech surveillance equipment and radar, would be flying over and doing surveillance missions over the borderlands? That you might like reading a science fiction novel or something. There's the kind of stuff that the kind of high-tech stuff that you see on the border now. You might it probably in ways it probably would have seemed unfathomable. Please. This is a Border Patrol agent. It's one of the CBP agents. It's a Special Forces unit. Did you know that Border Patrol agents look like that? No, there's been drastic changes.
What is he now? What's his weapon?
It's some sort of high-powered assault rifle, I think. I don't know what his weapon is exactly. And then here, I was just driving along in the border of New Mexico, just going on my way to El Paso, and I come across this armored vehicle, and I found it quite surprising. And the soldier was not out when I passed it, so I stopped the car, turned around, and as I turned around, the soldier came out. So I came around and spun around, and I waved at the soldier, and the soldier waved back, and then I took this picture. And then when I took this picture, he was looking at the surveillance. He's about 10 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border. He's pointed to the south towards the border. I didn't know what he was at that point. I didn't know what sort of mission it was. So I kept going about 10 miles up the road. There's another one of these armored vehicles, and it's a Striker. It's called a Striker, and it's a surveillance Striker. It doesn't have a weapon system on it, so it's mainly a high sophisticated surveillance armored vehicle that you see in Iraq and Afghanistan. And this second time, the guy was posted with a Border Patrol agent, so side by side. And then I go up another 10 miles, and there's another one posted with a Border Patrol agent side by side. Then I get up another 10 miles, and there's a forward operating base. Another thing for U.S. wars abroad that have been now imported to the U.S. borderlands. It's kind of a tactical rudimentary base put in really isolated areas to gain territorial control. That's the point of them. In this area, there is one of them. In that forward operating base, there are several of these tanks or armored vehicles, Strikers. So it was obvious at that time it was a Border Patrol mission, a joint task force. And then I figured out later it was indeed a joint task force. It was between the military and the Border Patrol. And that's one of many that happened on a yearly basis. It was a 5-day joint task force mission, and then the Strikers went back to Fort Bliss.
What is that thing that looks like a cloud?
That is me nervously taking a picture of a soldier. So the camera, as I drove, I wasn't stopping. So the motion, I think that's from the motion.
So in addition to you at the beginning you talked about 80,000 semi-different people that were part of Border Patrol. You also just mentioned the military. So the Border Patrol sometimes has military attached to it.
Yeah, or they do the joint task forces with the military. And sometimes it's that, I guess it's patrolling. Other times the military will help build the border wall or the border fence. I think a lot of that 700 miles of fencing, walls, barriers that we see on the U.S.-Mexico border was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. There's different, they build roads, they do all kinds of stuff. And so yeah, there's plenty of joint task forces with the military.
A few years ago, there were two Border Patrol agents who were responsible for killing a drug dealer, and the Border Patrol boys went to jail for charges that seemed frivolous, but they never got out of jail. What happened to them, you know?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure on that case. I know there was a case where Brian Terry, who was a Border Patrol agent, was shot and killed, and everyone assumes by drug smugglers around Nogales, and that's been a big case that a lot of people have talked about. But I'm not sure about the case that you're mentioning. Yeah. Does anybody know where that is? Very good answer. You are correct.
Last
That's-
night when I was looking at it, I thought it's not somewhere south by the looks of the trees.
There you go. Somebody's giving a good clue. Denver? Could be, right? Could be Denver. It's not Denver. Any more guesses? Usually people guess because Maureen gave it away.
Canada.
What?
Border of Canada.
It's the border of Canada. But it's this is SOTUS, New York. Usually people guess Texas, Tucson, California. Yeah, but this is actually in SOTUS, New York. Anybody know where SOTUS, New York is? Okay, that's the interesting thing about SOTUS, New York. It's about 15 miles away from Rochester, New York. Where's the border with where's that border? Where? Yeah, it's east of Rochester. So where? Actually the border crossing is far away, right? It's in Buffalo. It's in Niagara Falls. It's 2 hours away is the actual border line. But Rochester has a lake shore, right? And the lake shore is the border. And so in 2005, the first Border Patrol station happened, and they created the first Border Patrol station in Rochester. And the logic was that in Toronto, they were creating a ferry line between Toronto and Rochester. And so, they need a Border Patrol. And that was the logic. The ferry line closed down in 2006. Obviously, the Border Patrol did not close down. The Border Patrol the station started with 5 agents. Do you think they reduced the agents after the ferry closed down? Do you think they expanded them? Yes, they expanded them at approximately the rate of expansion that we're seeing on the U.S.-Canada border, which is higher rate of expansion than on the U.S.-Mexico border. Yep. So it went from, in the Rochester's case, it went from 4 agents to 26 agents.
Wow.
Still considerably less than, you have, approximately 18,000 agents on the U.S. southern border, and you have about a little over 3,000 on the U.S. northern border, but the rate of expansion has been higher. And one thing about SOTUS, right? So that the idea, actually, from an official standpoint, the U.S.-Canada border, there's more of a likelihood that there would be a terrorist incursion into the United States through the 4,000-mile U.S.-Canada border than through the U.S. southern border with Mexico. So that's the logic. That's the USA Patriot Act in 2001 called for a 300% increase of personnel and resources on the U.S.-Canada border. Other legislation has said during the hiring boom of the Border Patrol between 2005 and 2008, there was at least 20% of the Border Patrol agents hired have to go to the U.S.-Canada border. So there's stipulations that are increasing the amount of agents that are on this border. And one thing about it is that, notice that the agent is in SOTUS, New York. He's not on the borderline, right? He's at a grocery store. He's talking to a New York State trooper from the blue car. And one thing about SOTUS is it's in Wayne County. Wayne County is known for its apple orchards. There are lots of apple orchards. The soil by the lake is just absolutely fabulous to grow apples. So you bring in a lot of farm workers, 8,000 farm workers per year to Wayne County, New York. The farm workers go to that grocery store, marketplace. They go to all the, they go to the church, where there was a Border Patrol raid in after the Spanish language mass at the local Catholic church. So much that the community of Sodus started a group, I think it was called Church Watch, where they would stand out in front of the church every Sunday. And they set up a checkpoint, or New York State troopers set up a checkpoint on Sundays in front of the laundromat. So Sundays, obviously the day that people are going to go do their laundry, and they have to go through a checkpoint. New York State troopers, 3 cars, and 1 Border Patrol agent. If the state troopers were to suspect that a person doesn't have documents, then they send them to the Border Patrol. And so this is a reality that you're not only seeing in Sodus, you're seeing across the northern frontier, from Washington State to Maine. And if you notice, if you think back to the 100-mile map, did you remember the state of Maine? Devoured by the Border Patrol jurisdiction. Just completely, Border Patrol can roam anywhere in the state of Maine. Michigan as well. Florida is completely a Border Patrol jurisdiction.
And so in those places, are you saying that you talk about checkpoints? And so if we lived there, and we were an hour away from the border, we could be expected to be stopped?
Yeah.
For checkpoints? Are those fairly frequent?
They're not as frequent as along the southern border, but they're very frequent, more and more frequent on the northern border. And the most famous story happened to Senator Patrick Leahy. And he was traveling near Sodus in upstate New York, and he says he was 125 miles south of the border. And he was in a car that had license plates that said Vermont Senator. And he came up to a Border Patrol checkpoint. And according to Leahy's rendition before Congress, he said that the Border Patrol agent ordered him out of his car. Leahy said, "Under whose authority are you ordering me out of the car?" And the Border Patrol agent pointed to his gun, and he said, "That's the only authority I need." So that's an example of a northern border checkpoint. Yes, ma'am?
I was taking Amtrak from Denver to New York, and we were 100 miles south, but I don't remember exactly where because they woke us up. The Border Patrol woke us up to go through.
Yeah. So that's another thing, transportation checks. Rochester, New York has become a hub for transportation checks. The Border Patrol regularly gets on the Amtrak or the Greyhound or the different bus lines that run through there. A lot of times they're like Denver to New York. They're not crossing a border. They're going through the interior of the country. Yet an agent will come on, he'll ask, he or she will ask, everybody about their citizenship. The same sort of criteria within the 100-mile zone. Are you undocumented? Are you a drug smuggler? Are you a national security threat? Could get you pulled off into secondary questioning, and many people have been detained. One quick thing, too, about that, there was a Freedom of Information Act request done about the arrests at the Rochester Border Patrol station alone during these transportation checks. And according to the documents, one of the documents, it showed that they had classified the arrest by skin complexion. And that's exact wording they used, skin complexion. And medium complexion, 70%. Black complexion, 12%. Fair complexion, 0.8%. So that's if that rings true across the U.S.-Canada divide, which I think you're going to find similar numbers across, that would show you what might really be going on the U.S.-Canada border.
Right, that's basically what I was going to ask you is, if the ferry has been closed down, all that, and they don't have anything to do, and so now they're going and raiding Spanish language masses, really, is it about getting, I mean, the southern border just extending all the way up to the northern border? Because they're not really looking at Canadians, and they're probably not even looking at Middle Eastern terrorists as much as they're looking at any Latin Americans that have come up. Is that accurate, or?
I would say, you mean, just going by that, the kind of like, the arrest records from the Rochester Border Patrol Station. Yeah, I mean, I think that tells us a very vivid story about who's actually being questioned, who's being, what if a Border Patrol agent gets on an Amtrak train or goes to the grocery store or goes to the laundromat where farm workers are going, who are they going to end up arresting? I mean, that it's they say something different. The rhetoric around the buildup on the U.S.-Canada border, they say it's more about terrorism. But you see a lot of the internal enforcement. You see that 100-mile zone, you see it covered even beyond it. In Leahy's case, he says that it was 125 miles south. So that was past the 100-mile zone. So the idea that, and that's the thing about the northern border as well. In Rochester, 10 years ago, there wasn't any border patrol there. Erie, Pennsylvania. Again, Lakeshore, right? 10 years ago, was there border patrol there? No. Detroit, yes, 10 years ago, there were border patrol. In fact, Detroit Station, El Paso Station were the first two stations created in 1924. But there were few. There was only 40 in the Detroit sector. Now there's 400. Everyone in Southwest Detroit, which is a Latin American neighborhood, has a story about the Border Patrol. There's, a guy going to work at 4 a.m. at the bus stop has been stopped and arrested by the Border Patrol. A guy going to the Latino Family Community Center was stopped and, by the Border Patrol and questioned. So there's lots and lots of stories about who's being arrested and who's not. And there's some places where right along the borderline, you're not going to see the big walls like you see in Mexico. But there are places like the St. Clair River between Port Huron and Detroit where you see 11 surveillance towers side by side by side by side by side with their high-powered cameras, with the radar that look into Ontario. And the feeds, the radar, the video feeds come back to this $30 million operational control room in Selfridge. Selfridge is a military base near Detroit. Now, mind you, Detroit's the city that just turned off the water. Detroit's is a city that's been cutting public transportation. Detroit's a city that's, if you go to Detroit, how many people have been to Detroit?
They're selling all their art.
Right. The homes are collapsing in Detroit. And yet, right up the road, there's a $30 million operational control room with a gigantic video wall where agents sit and watch the feeds of the radar, of the videos, of the St. Clair River flowing by for hours and hours and hours and hours. So that's,
I keep thinking of all the moose that are getting their pictures.
yeah, you get some good wildlife probably. All right, you can go ahead.
No constitution, so what percentage of U.S. population is in it?
Yeah, I should have. Yeah, 2/3.
Yeah.
200 million people approximately live. So if you notice, it goes through all the major population centers. LA, New York, Chicago, I think's in it. So that's another thing to think about as well. Like when you think about the drones, for example, when they're flying at 30,000 feet. Who sees them? Where are they flying? Are they flying in the 100-mile zones? Are they flying over the city of Tucson, where I live? Are they flying over the city of San Diego? Are they flying over New York? Are they flying over Chicago? Where are they flying? They can fly anywhere within this jurisdiction. So it's an important consideration, even not even considering undocumented immigration. If you just consider this idea, the connection that you could have with the National Security Agency and all the talk that's been around the National Security Agency these days. What kind of, if the surveillance equipment, like where I live, you can't go anywhere without, being on camera 500 times. I have to go, every time I go down the I-19 away from my house, there's this tower that looks into my car and just sees the heat of my body, That's all around, and this is extending deep into the United States. And you could even make the case that it's, as the talk has been around police agencies and recently as well, that this is going further and further inland. Yeah, so it's.
So with all this increase in surveillance and all this, I mean, one, it sounds very much like what's happening with police forces, getting all this free or nearly free military stuff
Yeah.
that they're giving away, that they're taking advantage of that, and it certainly changes the nature of human interaction. But the other thing is, what percentage, I mean, have they, is there been, how many cases of people who were bringing in toxic stuff to the United States have they found?
Terrorism, you mean? Zero.
Terrorism.
Zero. Zero.
Just
Nothing documented. There's this possibility that something's happened that hasn't been released to the public,
Yeah.
which I doubt, because a lot, if something happens overseas, it's front page news, You figure that if that would have happened, we'd know about it. There's a possibility it hasn't. I mean, a lot of people were like, if you ask people about terrorism, they'll refer to the Millennium Bomber. He tried to come into the United States in 1999 through the U.S.-Canada border, and he had a bombs, and so they'll point to that incident and say, hey, that astute border guard, and he actually was coming through a port of entry. That astute border guard, to credit for stopping whatever intentions that guy had. But so in the post 9/11 era, there has been absolutely nothing yet. But that's a key point. All this like upsurge of budgets and resources and technologies and the war posture, the militaristic posture you're seeing, the increasing militaristic posture, it comes from this idea of a war on terror, right? So that raises a really important question. When you have coming through, like this summer, everyone here saw the pictures of the children, right? The children, 66,000 children have come across. You have people coming across like those children who, for a variety of reasons, a lot of them have testimonies of fearing violence, back in their home countries. A lot of them are trying to reunite with their family members, and those are, the majority of people. Imagine if it's not 60,000 terrorists, they're talking about 60,000 children from Central America, yet there's Rick Perry and Sean Hannity with a machine gun aimed at Mexico during the height of this influx of children.
And they weren't even sneaking.
No, they were turning themselves in. Yeah, totally turning themselves in. So.
Well, and I just keep coming back to that $18 billion figure and thinking how much we're not doing in this country to help people and to prevent violence within the borders because we don't have the money, because all this money is
Yeah.
going there into defense. And
Yeah.
I'm like, what if they devoted those funds to internal, we might have a lot less gun violence, we might have a lot less poverty, whatever. I don't know, that's just stunning to me.
Yeah, look at Detroit. Like, why is all the money funneled into Homeland Security, $30 million into this war room, pretty much, when they're cutting off water service to the people that live there? It doesn't make sense. If housing, different employment opportunities, education, public transportation. I actually look into this in the very last chapter of Border Patrol Nation. I grew up in Niagara Falls, New York. Niagara Falls, New York has a similar trajectory as Detroit. It was an industrial town. Niagara Falls did not put its eggs in the tourism basket. It put its eggs in the industry, and had chemical and metallurgical industry. My dad worked in a plant in Niagara Falls. This industry started leaving the city, like many places, much like many places in the Rust Belt, like Buffalo. My dad lost his job in the year 2000, and the kind of almost destruction that you see in Niagara Falls, like the houses that have fallen, it looks nothing like it did when I was a kid. Main Street, Niagara Falls is completely boarded up, right? there's so many potholes through the city that I feel like I'm going to go down in the Grand Canyon when I'm driving through Niagara Falls. There's whole neighborhoods that have been razed, and it looks like a war zone. It looks like a war zone. There's one area in Niagara Falls I look at, and it's just an empty field, and there's a few houses, just stumps of houses that used to be a neighborhood when I was a kid, and you look at that and you go, wait, we're putting all this money in Homeland Security because there's some sort of enemy that's going to get us, right on the other side of this line. They're going to come and get us. Yet this is happening in my hometown. This is what's happening to like my people where I grew up. Looks like the war already hit. Looks like the bombs already fell. So in a way, it's a really almost powerful way to look at this kind of upsurge in the Homeland Security or even anything. Looking at the Border Patrol is not only looking at the Border Patrol, it's also looking at the solutions or how looking at the federal budget and looking how, is there a better way to spend this money? What is security really? That question is really important. What is security? If somebody loses their home, right, isn't that the worst possible state of insecurity one could possibly be in? So wouldn't it make more sense, if we're talking about security to invest in housing or, so that sort of angle is an important one.
Have you studied any parallels between this and Germany in the 30s?
No, but that's a very provocative point and people bring it up. There's people that a lawyer that I was talking to in Buffalo, and they were talking about Rochester and the people getting on the buses and pulling people off buses because they don't have the correct documents or because they look a certain way. And she said, you got to look at the 1930s in Germany. You have to. And then when you top that off with detention centers, 250 detention centers across the country, 34,000 people in detention center beds on any given day, and not for criminal charges, for administrative charges, because they're in a deportation process. And a lot of those detention centers are privately owned as well. So private companies are making a lot of money.
Are any of these resources used for something more ethical, like human trafficking?
Well, yeah, they say that's definitely in the rhetoric, for sure. They'll talk about human trafficking quite a bit. Like we want to break up the trafficking rings, human trafficking, drug trafficking, those sorts of. That's definitely a strong talking point for the CBP or the Border Patrol. How much and if they do catch somebody in a trafficking ring, there's definitely an article written about it or it's made public. The percentage of that compared to just like somebody walking across, somebody coming across to get a job or now a kid trying to reunite with their parents is very low, but they do say that and they do have operations around trafficking.
Chances are, my experience is if somebody who carries a gun, his IQ soars downward, and they couldn't catch one if they tried. It just seems that's the impression I get.
That's probably a sound impression. I would, and I I interviewed a lot of Border Patrol agents to write the book, and there's a lot of one of the guys I interviewed, he was a gun instructor he worked out of the Casa Grande station in Arizona, but he taught guns, he taught to shoot guns. He's like, I just have a talent doing it. And then he said, but I hate guns. And I went, what? and he actually was good. He's actually a student too. So one of his projects is to go to gun shops and talk to them about guns. And he's into gun reduction, gun control. And he doesn't have a gun himself. He's like, I'm the only agent that doesn't have a gun. So but he's expert shot. He is an expert shot at the same time. It's just there's so many really interesting nuances that you find with people as you know in the variety of interviews. But go ahead.
What's the average age of work?
I don't know what the average age is, but it's fairly young. I don't think they hire anyone new over the age of 40. They'll hire up till the age of 40. There are Border Patrol agents over the age of 40, but they have to be hired before the age of 40. They, during their hiring surges, they would target, they targeted veterans or people. They go to like military bases overseas. So you've had a lot of military people join the ranks of the Border Patrol. One of them, the Buckeye Blitz, which was a hiring program they did in Ohio. They went to areas in 2008 that were really affected by the recession, and they began to hire in those areas. So they would target people that were in, perhaps in economic straits, so to speak. And to be a Border Patrol agent, you just have to have your GED, so you don't have to have a college education. And the starting salary for a Border Patrol is about 70, with overtime, is about 60 to 70,000. A rookie can make $60 to $70,000 in the first year. So it's a huge draw for people in the borderlands, because you're looking at different communities that have depressed economies, where a teacher makes $20,000 a year, and then the Border Patrol agents, they make 70 grand their first year. They're driving around their nice cars. And
Are any of these guys immigrants themselves?
there's a lot of Latino border, 50%, around 50%. In Border Patrol Nation, I dedicate a chapter to an agent who got fired, and his mother was from Mexico, and he proclaimed to another agent that he was proud to be a Mexican. What he meant was that he was proud of his Mexican heritage, and that ended up in this big discussion with the agent, and another agent ended up reporting him for saying that. So one of the key things, you should read it, but one of the key things is that the agent said to him, this might be true, there might be 50% Latino, agents, but the agent said to him, you have to forget your Mexican side. He told him that, and he responded and said, no, I don't have to forget, I love my Mexican side. So this at least in this case, and I was able to interview this agent who was fired like several times to get like a really vivid, like how that story unfolded. Yeah.
I was going to ask kind of what you were saying now about the morale. It seems like you interviewed, talked to a lot of agents, and here they are doing what they're doing, and whatever that is, because it sounds like there's a lot of things that we don't know about what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's not publicized at all, and how many people they pick up, or what their outcome is, and all that other stuff. But what's the morale of these people
So almost everyone says there's low morale, from the Border Patrol Union to different Border Patrol agents that I've interviewed, to Robert Lee Merrill. He's an academic who did a big study on the Border Patrol, and he published a book called Patrolling Chaos, and he documents the kind of low morale that he found. A lot of Border Patrol end up, sitting on their X's, as they call it, so they just sit in one place and they look into the empty desert all day long and nothing, right? And they play video games or whatever, I don't know. There's an additional analysis to this, that you're trained as an agent, you're trained in you're on the front lines of defense, you're trained in this way. It's almost, there's a hyper patriotic way that you're defending the homeland, right? And so there's a lot of adrenaline. If you ever look at a recruiting video for the Border Patrol, they're diving out of helicopters and rappelling and doing all this exciting stuff and running around, there's guns. And then, a lot of the agents that I talked to, one told me of the story where he carried a kid who died in his arms out of the desert, and there's many stories like that where an agent will, they think they're doing one thing, but then they see the reality of it. And in his case, he described the story where he was describing like the kind of stuff coming out of the kid's mouth, and as he carried him, and how it just hit him so hard. Lots of Border Patrol agents find dead bodies out, and they have a chaplain, right? They have a chaplain, but if you find a dead body and there's and every single agent's found a dead body. One guy told me he was walking down the side of a hill and he accidentally kicked a skull as he was walking down. If you find a dead body, you continue on your shift. And I talked to an agent that said that's the hardest thing you can do. You have to just he found a body of a woman who had just died, probably an hour before. And they looked at, they had to call it was on the Tono Altum Reservation, which is a Native American reservation, and they called the tribal police, and they came in and they turned her over, and she was purple, because her blood had come to the bottom of her body, and he helped the tribal police put her on a truck, and they had a tire on the truck, so this kind of process of dehumanization almost, and then they bring her to the the forensic office, but this sort of those experiences that Border Patrol agents have and what they're expected to do and how they're expected to.
And then there's thousands of these bodies that are unclaimed and unidentified.
Yeah, there's unclaimed. There's the desaparecidos. There's bodies. Desconocidos. The unknown. And then there's people call the desert in Arizona a graveyard. Like some people say, that only a percentage, maybe even less than half of the bodies have been found who have perished, judging by the families who are looking for their loved ones who have disappeared. Because there's different organizations in Arizona that field calls from families from Latin America, from Mexico, from Central America, who are looking for their loved ones. They say, I think they crossed through the desert, but now we haven't heard from them in 3 weeks, or we haven't heard from them in a month, or we haven't heard from them in 4 weeks, 4 months, And so there's actual rescue missions or people that go out combing the desert, but.
Do they photograph the bodies and then mass bury them, or how do they handle the remains?
The remains are brought, I think they're brought to a mortuary, and then there's a forensic, what's it called, laboratory where they bring a lot of the bodies to. So they try to identify the bodies first and foremost. A lot of bodies they can identify, but they do, and they also look for, different, sometimes there's some sort of, memento that the person's carrying that's special to them, or who knows what, but.
They're cremated, buried?
There's some that are buried. I'm not sure what happens to all the bodies. I know that there's cemeteries that have John Doe, gravestones of people.
I'm going to pass a basket. If you want to make a little donation, don't feel any pressure. This is for Todd, not for us.
Todd, what led you particularly to write this book?
This book, there's a lot of reasons. I guess one of them is I've been working on border issues or issues involving Mexico or Latin America for quite some time. I have been living on and off in Tucson and southern Arizona since the late 1990s. I've lived in southern Mexico as well, in Oaxaca, and I've been working on looking at border issues. My first journalistic thing that I did was I went and photographed the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers building a wall in Douglas, Arizona. So when they were first building the border wall in 1998. And so I've been I worked with this organization called Border Links for 4 years. That organization, we went back and forth, we were constantly in Mexico. During that time, the upsurge of immigration from Mexico was unbelievable. It is literally an exodus of people coming from Mexico. And we go to this place called Altar, which is just a little bit south of the border. And we'd stay there for a few days and just watch the buses come in, and people would unload off the buses, and we talked to person after person. And one time I met this Guatemalan man there, and he's looking, it was one of those cases that we were just talking about. His daughter disappeared like two months before that, and last he'd heard that she had walked across the desert, and he was with us the entire night. And just hearing him and looking at his face, and he was in Mexico undocumented, so he came all the way from his town, like he lives in Huehuetenango in Guatemala. He came all the way up to the border to try to find his daughter. And he asked me, how could I help him find his daughter? And I knew there was no way I could help him, And those stories, are just so, there's story after story after story that are just so tragic, powerful, important, to document, to talk about, to bring up, and those are stories that define our world right now. And those sorts of stories combined with the kind of upsurge of the border enforcement, especially, when I was working at Border Links, I started in June of 2001, right? So September 11th, 2001 happened 3 months after I was with Border Links. I saw those sorts of transitions. I saw the buildup. I saw how Border Patrol changed. I saw the kind of the drastic changes. Almost some places look nothing like they looked before. If you go, and some places there's so many Border Patrol agents, like the Tohono O'odham Reservation in southern Arizona. You go there's more Border Patrol agents cruising around than there are locals now. And then 10 years ago, that was not the case. In the 1990s, there were no Border Patrol in the Tohono O'odham Nation. So those sorts of changes. And another thing about the Tohono O'odham Nation is I have a lot of friends on the Tohono O'odham Nation. And the talk of not only is there a lot of Border Patrol looking for undocumented people crossing, there's Border Patrol harassing people on the nation. So people are getting pulled over all the time. They're being spotlighted. They say that Border Patrol is going at 90 miles per hour through the reservation. I interviewed a guy who was pulled out of his truck and maced. No, he was maced, pulled out of his truck, and then beaten with a baton by a Border Patrol agent. There's home invasions throughout the Tohono O'odham Nation for anyone that lives within 25 miles of the border. That's another one of those Constitution-free zone things. If you live 25 miles from the border, Border Patrol can enter your property without a warrant. So that's happening, all throughout the Tohono O'odham Nation. Everyone's talking about home invasions, stuff that you worry about if you're at war, right? So this sorts of stories are just too much, and I think a lot of the stories that I heard, they've deeply affected me over the years, and that was probably one of the biggest impetuses to sit down and do this project.
So have you talked to, have politicians sought you out, or people?
So I'm a more of a journalist, so I'm not, I sought out politicians to talk to in the book, so I go and try to interview people, but I'm not there to lobby them, right? I'm just there to hear what they're pushing for. I did do a chapter on South Carolina, and I interviewed the politician who's pushed that the state of South Carolina has its own border patrol, its own immigration enforcement unit. It's the only state to have its own immigration enforcement unit at a state level with their own cars and their own uniforms and everything. So yeah, that's in that sense. I sought out politicians to look at their viewpoints and to look at how this kind of border policy, because a lot of politicians will say, my constituents demand, my constituents say that we need a bigger wall, my constituents say this and that and the other thing.
Have you sent your book to Jon Stewart?
What? Oh,
Jon Stewart?
what?
Send him your book, because he talks to people like you all the time.
Yeah, I should. Maybe I'll send him my book.
Sure,
Oh, maybe yeah, who knows?
Absolutely.
Who knows?
You mentioned Border Links. Do other organizations come to mind that are working on these issues?
Yeah.
I know you write for NACLA.
Yeah.
I was wondering if maybe you could speak to some of the movements, larger popular movements that are maybe pushing better relations
Yeah, there's a lot. There's more and more. There's a lot of examples now. I always think there could be a lot more, given the degree of what we're seeing. But just in southern Arizona, we have a number of different movements. So, No More Deaths comes to mind, which is they go out and put desert camps in the desert to help people who are, crossing if they're in distress or they need medical care, or if they need water. There's lots of humanitarian organizations along those lines where they go out and put water in the desert. No More Deaths actually has they do lots of reports too. So they look at the Border Patrol and say, they have one huge one called The Culture of Cruelty that looks at short-term detention and abuses by Border Patrol to people in short-term detention. So they have a number of reports like that. There's protection networks throughout Tucson, and I'm just talking Tucson, There's protection networks are really interesting too, because they're usually of undocumented and documented people that live in the community who are all in communication with each other. So if somebody gets pulled over by the police, and if you get pulled over by the police in Tucson and they suspect you're undocumented, first you're in the 100-mile zone. So it's the 100-mile zone, so they'll call Border Patrol. But second, it's SB 1070. And SB 1070, the immigration law that passed in 2010, obligates a police officer, if they suspect that you don't have documents, to call Border Patrol. So people are getting Border Patrol called on them constantly by the police. And so the protection networks, if you're pulled over by the police, they'll call, you call whoever's on call, and then all of a sudden there's a whole group of people that mobilize. They'll come out to the area. But there's also, a protection network also, if you are detained, they'll go in and take care of your children. There's all kinds of, interesting stuff. And then there's national immigration rights movements. I know there's a lot of stuff going on in here I've been hearing about. There you go. So Colorado's a stellar example, So there's hope, there's hope, there's a lot of different people that are doing in organizations that are standing up. But at the same time, it's so remarkable, especially if I travel to the East Coast, especially how little people there's people that know what's going on the U.S.-Mexico border, but it's amazing how many people don't know what's going on there. It's just amazing to me. Like there's a wall. Stuff that we might take for granted that we know. It's just it's quite startling that how many people don't know what's going on.
Can you recommend a documentary, maybe?
A documentary, The Undocumented, is a good one. That's about Arizona, and then you.
Constitution-free zone, and I can't go to sleep tonight until. Does that mean no?
Yeah.
rights, or what-
So that's the ACLU's term. It's I would say the constitutional mangled zone. Mainly because the reason the logic behind the ACLU is that your Fourth Amendment right to search and seizure is altered, mangled, in those zones like around where I live, the checkpoints. They can pull you. They can do visual inspections. If they deem you one of their three missions raises alarms, they can look through your stuff. They can interrogate you. At the same time, speaking of the last question of the pushback, there's now people that are pushing back against that. So I would almost call it a constitution and debate zone, because there's people going through these checkpoints that are refusing to speak. Saying, do I have to answer this? It's my constitutional right not to answer you. So there is pushback, and there is an organization that just developed in Arivaca, Arizona, that's the first one I think that has existed that is actually monitoring the checkpoints. So they go out to a Border Patrol checkpoint and they sit out there with binoculars and they watch every single person that they question, and especially if they're pulled into secondary. So, sir?
I was going to ask you about the pressure on people coming to this country. Have you done any research into going down to Central America or Mexico?
Yeah, that's
See
good.
what's
That's
happening
That's a good segue to start wrapping up. And this picture actually is on the southern border of Mexico with Guatemala. I just went on a trip there a week ago. A week ago, I was on this border. I was on this border interviewing that very soldier. I went there because of the stuff that's happened over the summer to look into the upsurge of immigration from Central America, but particularly to look at how Mexico is building up its southern border with a lot of U.S. funding. And so that was the angle that I was looking at. And one of the things that Mexico has done is created 3 enforcement belts, and this is right on the Guatemala border. And one of them was to deploy 2,000 soldiers on the border and 400 police right on the border. And then the second one is a bunch of immigration checkpoints, more than people in the Southwest United States complain. I went from the Guatemalan border north to the town of Arriaga, and Arriaga is where the train leaves, the Bestia. That's where that leaves. So a lot of people will have to travel up through this kind of gauntlet of checkpoints. I went through 6 checkpoints to get to this. And checkpoints where you're talking about Constitution-free zone, totally Constitution-free zone. I had to open up my bags, almost every time, interrogated, at one of them, everyone had to get off the bus. So what happens is the Central American folks, they get off, they either walk the 200 miles or the 150 miles to get to Arriaga, and that's where they get the train. So they walk those 150 miles, or they go on public transportation, get out of the public transportation before the checkpoints, evade the checkpoints, get on it, and keep going. So you see the kind of similar evasion of the border, of the border apparatus that you see in the southern border. If you could turn the slide off. This guy, I interviewed him on my trip. He is from Honduras. He was at the immigration checkpoint, the immigration migrant shelter in Arriaga. He had been there for 2 weeks. He and his wife were traveling north. They were actually tried to get to Arriaga the first time, but they were deported because they didn't get out of the bus or out of the van at a checkpoint. So they were hoping that the agent at the checkpoint wasn't going to ask them for their papers, and he asked everyone, and he just ended up showing him his laminated card from Honduras, and he was deported. He was a taxi driver for 12 years in Tegucigalpa, which is the capital of Honduras. The first 6 years, it was scratching by, barely making ends meet, but okay. The last 6 years, higher and higher extortions from like a more ingrained kind of organized crime network, where he's paying almost $9 a day to this network, making less money, and he talked a lot about the military coup that happened in Honduras in 2009, and kind of the upsurge of violence that happened in the country, and the the upsurge of poverty as well. So if you look at the stats in Honduras, poverty, extreme poverty, unemployment, underemployment, everything has gone up since this military coup in 2009, where the president was overthrown. The president actually was one of the reforms the president was giving was a very moderate raise in minimum wage, but he was ousted in 2009. So he talked a lot about like that, and the idea that with no opportunities, the correlation between the upsurge in crime, and it became untenable for him and his family and his 3 children. In his case, he left his 3 children in Tegucigalpa. So he and his wife were trying to travel north to get to the United States. Their idea was to get a stable job in the United States and then bring their children up after that. So that was his story. If you could do it one more. And when I was there in Honduras, or not in Honduras, in Arriaga, where the trains, there's tons of operations going on in the train yards by Mexican immigration. So Mexican immigration, accompanied by the Army and the police. And if you look at Mexico's been bolstering its borders with, at least helped by funding from the United States. So they got all kinds of new technologies. The United States has given like night vision goggles, motion sensors, stuff that you'd see on the US-Mexico border. They're helping them build facilities. They're giving them like kind of contraband detection, equipment. And
To keep people in?
no, to stop Central American immigration.
Central American.
It's Central American immigration. So Mexico is now, one U.S. official said our border is no longer with Mexico. Our border is now the Chiapas border with Guatemala. So one of the things that Mexico announced a new kind of border enforcement plan in July, and one of them was to do operations around the train so people wouldn't board the train. And we went to the train yard in Arriaga, and everyone said, "Oh, people are not here anymore. There used to be lots of Central Americans here, but they're not here anymore." But if you go 2 miles, 3 miles down the rails, you'll find them, hiding right by the rails. They'll be about. So I walked like 3 miles down the rails, and I met a group, and it was a group of about 10 people. This guy right here is from Guatemala, and he told me, he said, "Do you want to know why I'm going north?" And he said he pulled out his wallet and he pulled out a picture of his son. That's his son. He hadn't seen his son since 2006. His son was 10 years old in that picture. His son is now 18 years old. He said, "That's why I'm going to Miami. I'm going to Miami." And then he said, "I've been deported 3 times. I have no money." And he's sitting by the rails, right? So him and this group are sitting by this rails for this train, and everyone knows how dangerous this train is, right? They're in Arriaga. They're about to go through the worst dangerous parts. But he said, and he'd already been deported 3 times, but he said, "I'm going to make it no matter what because of my kid." And then he pulled out and he said, "Take a picture of this and show it to the people in the United States." And so did that, and that's a picture of his child. And I don't know where that guy is now. It was a week and a half ago, and he was by the rails. And I mean, I don't know where he is. He had no money. He could be. I hope he's at least in Mexico City. I hope. But that guy's traveling right now, and he's trying to meet his son. So that's
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.